When I talk about after capitalism, right? I really think we're talking a 20-ish year journey here. Right? This is not something that's going to be happening overnight. If you set that 20 to 30-year time frame, and that was based on the research, capitalism has been around for, one might argue, 300-400 years, depending on how you want to set the date. So that's a system that's been pretty entrenched, right? And it's not going to just simply go away. In 2012, the students came up with this idea of let's talk about what's after capitalism. So I started scanning, and actually, if you look at this map, I was looking for broad signals of change relating to what's after capitalism, and use the steep categories to just see, what's interesting, what's happening there. And the other two branches, well, I started to add on new branches as I started to find ideas about what might be next. In 2012, I did not necessarily have anything against capitalism per se. My position is let's not like demonize it and say capitalism is the root of all evil. And can we say it just doesn't fit with where we're going? The system is out of alignment with the emerging future and leave it at that. And I found that some of the works that talked about the future after capitalism, they were different, but they were just kind of reform concepts. How do we make capitalism work? And then the Horizon 3 was really how do we change it? I will tell you that there were a lot more works about Horizon 2 than Horizon 3, a lot more. A lot of books saying what's wrong with capitalism. Good, we need that. A little bit less, but also a lot of books about how do we fix it. And then a really small thing on what else. My conclusion was, again, remember I said we can't fix it. So you have all these images of the future. How do you make sense of them, right? Like, how do you analyze them? How do you compare them? This might be a useful template you could use for many different purposes. What is it that's special about a guiding image? Is that emotional, spiritual? No, it's not the technical stuff. Does this image make us want to work for it? What's a successful image? It has that ability that people say, yeah, I'm all right, I'm in and I'm going. I'm going to work for this. I'm committed. You know what I mean? And so I think that's a kind of a key aspect of what we're looking for in these images. Do we like these, or which one do we like, or what combination do we like? And then we'll do the plan. But let's find out where we want to go before we start planning, right? Capitalism produces what it produces. And like I say, you can tweak it a little bit, but it's all you're getting is a little more or a little less of the same thing. It produces growth, inequality. It produces a lot of technology as well, right? So that's what it produces. And I think we're moving into a future where growth, inequality, and tech centricity, if you will, may not be the way that we want to go. If you buy that argument that it's just not a fit anymore, here we go. If you had to say, what is the problem here, right? Is we've created a situation where we live in an economy and people are thought of economic units. And it shouldn't be the other way around. Shouldn't the economy serve our lifestyle rather than our lifestyle serve the economy? And I think that's just such a nice, simple way to understand this. And if we said, hey, wait a second, what if we created a future in which we had things, if you will, I think rebalance, where the economy is serving the society and not the other way around? When I say that, 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're moving into a transformational future, there's going to be skepticism. So you have to, as we know in good futures work, you've got to, if you will, build your case, build your support. What makes you say that? The first one, shifting values. Basically, this is based on the World Value Survey from Ron Engelhardt. It's all around the world. It's in over 100 countries. They've been doing it since the 1970s, every 5 years. It's produced a set of data that suggests patterns and values change over time. Now, we could play a long time with that. The priorities, the values shift priorities are different than what has been historically true. So one more point on this. If you look at modern values, victory, growth, achievement, number one, competition, it's a beautiful fit with capitalism. It's perfect. And the data shows that we are at the peak of modern values and have probably started on a decline, and they're being replaced by these postmodern and integrals. So if you play that out for 10 or 20 years, the priorities are different and the fit doesn't make sense anymore. Now, right now, it might be hard to see it, but the data is very slow and steady. the second one, and I mentioned technology acceleration, both could be a super duper wonderful enabler of after capitalism, and it also, if we use the bounty of technology and we redistribute what the wealth that it produces equitably, it's amazing. Right? Even if we did it right now, but imagine, if we keep on the accelerating pathway, right? I mean, right now we have enough wealth to basically make everybody in the world have a decent living if we distributed it equitably, but we don't. And capitalism won't. It's not what it does. Inequality, no doubt about that. I don't know if anybody has read Piketty's 2014 book. It's like this thick. I actually went through it. A lot of times you just kind of talk about something. I said, all right, I'm going to go through this and make sure I actually understand what the heck is going on here. And I went through the whole thing. And if you need any convincing, just do it. Because then you come out of there, you go, okay, I get it now. This is not a hypothetical. It's the way the system is set up. This is what it produces. So if we stay in capitalism, we're going to have to live with this. And I would argue that what's happening again with these value shifts, we're saying we no longer tolerate this inequality. All right, automation and labor. I think that's, we've talked probably enough about this to drive us all crazy here. Again, I think the whole question here has come up in our scenario work. It comes up all the time. How do we use these tools? Not that the tools themselves are kind of interesting, but how we use them is do we use it to replace people, or do we use it to enhance people? It's simple, but not easy, right? What we found with stagnation is when you look at what we're counting as economic growth these days, is it really economic growth? Are we fooling around with the numbers? Are we calling things growth that ain't really growth? And if this staggering inequality continues, people even have enough money to buy anything. So again, present trends continue. We have some real questions about economic growth. Now, why would that, in a sense, that's actually kind of good news for after capitalism. However, the current baseline standard economic thought is growth is essential. We have to grow. It's the only way capitalism can keep going. It has to keep finding new places to grow. And there's some interesting things. I don't know if you've seen these before, but these are the vertical forest. There's an Italian design firm, Stefano Boeri is the guy. These are like a dozen of these projects around the world where he tries to build nature into buildings. I found that doing some scanning work for the U.S. Forest Service. Okay, so obviously climate is a big issue, right? No doubt about it. I think the U.S. is like the best example of late stage capitalism, right? We are capitalism in its most exaggerated form. But there are certainly, and the biggest difference, I hate to say global north and south because it's just, it's such a huge overgeneralization. But, if you'll allow that, clearly there are nations that are where growth is necessary or needed, right? And, so the anti-growth argument is certainly much more prevalent in those late stage capitalist places like the US that are over conservative, right? It's like, if you will, that sort of those value shifts that say, all right, we need to work on environmental preservation and community and networking and local stuff and all those good things, right? If you will. 10 or 20 years, the blues, if you will, the numbers are on the side of the blue. And I think eventually they're going to start to pull away from because the red, if you will, the reds group is shrinking, the blues is growing, but right now it's a stalemate. It's really hard to get anything done. My complaint, if you will, about the left is I wish the left could be a little smarter and not be so confrontational. Both sides tend to favor local politics. I ended up in these three images here. So I didn't start out saying I want three images or here's the three images. I just let the research and speak for itself. And when I took all the ideas and clustered them together, they seem to fall into these buckets. Now, probably not a big surprise to anyone. The circular commons bucket is, if you will, environmentally driven. The non-workers paradise is really that socially, politically, post-work driven future. And then there's also a fair bit of ideas that we ended up calling tech-led abundance, where, you have things like you probably heard of the singularity and, Homo Deus and, all of the super intelligent AI, all that kind of stuff. Those images are out there. So they fall into these three different buckets here. Now, I'm not going to, I'll just give you a hint. A lot of people end up looking at this and saying, well, isn't it somewhere in the middle of this? But I wanted to keep them separate because I thought in terms of appeal, I think environmentally driven folks will say, oh, I really love that circular economy. And, the non-workers paradise, the post-work, labor, and I love that, right? And then the tech-led abundance, obviously there's a lot of tech supporters out there. So maybe by keeping them separate and broad, we can bring more people into the discussion. That's why I've kept them separate, but I recognize ideally it's probably a little bit of all three, right? So go back to our three horizons. And we've done some research in Houston where we looked at historical sets of scenarios. So sets of scenarios that were set in the past and went out, 10 or 20 years. We found 78 sets that we fit into this, what we call these archetypes. We use a variation of Jim Dator's archetype technique. An archetype is a pattern of change. All right, 4 patterns of change. The first pattern we call the baseline picture. What does the world look like if current trends stay on track and there are no major shifts? And you'll see that we call that, the current neoliberal capitalist system. And what we say is that baseline system basically describes the first horizon. What's currently happening right now? And what we think is going to happen is eventually, as that system starts to lose fit, as neoliberal capitalism loses fits, it declines. And what comes behind it? Well, collapse, unfortunately, says, eventually when that current baseline falls apart, it falls apart. And so I don't talk about them in any depth, but I do mention in the book that there are some, there are definitely some, collapse futures out there, folks, right? We all know that. New equilibrium is a little bit more interesting, perhaps, because new equilibrium says the pathway to the future involves a series of loops where, if you will, the baseline system starts to change and then it chickens out and it retreats and it advances and it retreats and advances and retreats. And the reason that happens is, at some point, the advance starts to get people nervous. They go, oh, that's too much change. Let's pull it back. And so when we looked at those 78 scenario sets, we found the most common pattern to getting to that horizon 3 was this series of new equilibrium loops, which surprised us a little bit because before we did the research, we would have guessed the most common pathway to transformation, which is horizon 3, is collectivism. But the research that we did, now it's not definitive, but said actually overwhelmingly it was new equilibrium. And it's that series of loops. And we get there gradually with starts and stops. Research, I did some ideas of what might that new equilibrium looping thing, what are some scenarios for what that might look like. And then finally, horizon 3 describes the world of transformation, right? And that is a new system. And so, of course, the guiding images were being proposed as new systems with new rules and horizon 3. And again, we're saying that journey might be 10, 20, 30 years, depending on how things go. We found one example where you could maybe make that case. And we argued about it, but we found one where maybe. But most of the time, you got to go through that transition phase, which is why the change takes so long. The circular commons, right? That's the first idea. And again, it builds upon sustainability, going to kind of the next level. Now, you'll see that I noted a couple things here. I highlighted degrowth. So this idea now it's still on the edge. It's not mainstream, but 10 years ago, if you had said degrowth, they would have locked you up. They might still do it today. But I think it's a really powerful, and I did not come into the research saying degrowth is what we need. But when you look at, certainly more growth, there's just no way that you can, it's hard to see how you save the environment with growth continuing at its current rate. Steady state, well, maybe, right? That seems reasonable, but it's like, I don't think it's enough. So, in the course of the research, I came to say we've actually got to, at least for a period of time, have a deliberate policy to say, hey, we got to slow this stuff down. We got to let the environment recover. And what was so interesting, I guess, I shouldn't say interesting, but the pandemic showed us that if we do slow down economic growth, the environment starts to recover. So it can be done. You have to choose to do it. So, super controversial idea. I said, 5 years ago, I've been really careful about where I mentioned it in public. Now, I think it's more, more, people don't think you're crazy if you bring it up anymore. But, know your audience, right? And then I guess this, yeah, the reintegrating with nature piece, that is just one that I think, so we've created a lifestyle where, I think it's pretty obvious. We just don't even realize like what nature is anymore. And that's probably one of the reasons why we don't see it as a problem, right? Because we live all our life indoors and on, behind screens and stuff. And so some of you saying, well, what about socialism and what about communism? And I would say personally, I've got no problem with either one. However, especially in the US, using those two words, you might as well bring out the boogeyman. You just, people are just scared. You can't bring up those words without people getting into a panic. I don't think it's right, but that's the truth of it. So to me, I say we've got to avoid. And some of you, I'm sure you're familiar with Sohail and Ayatollah, the futurist, who talks about used futures. Like this is an old idea. Let's not bring back the old idea. It's used. Let's, if you will, create a new idea. But honestly, when I look at the non-workers paradise, does it have a lot in common with socialist and communist principles? It does. But it's avoiding the baggage of the term. So it's not fair, but there you go. And again, here, when you do the research, the long-term trends pointing towards post-work are really, really strong. A lot of times when I'm talking to audiences who are part of the top 10, 20% knowledge worker, class, that they're working more than ever. But if you look across the whole of society, there's no doubt that the amount of work people are doing is going down, and it has been for quite some time. Okay? So the trends are moving in that direction. And now you talk about, you bring in AI and automation to that. To me, like that, while it's scary, right? Because right now, if you lose your job in the current context, that's a really bad thing. However, if we had something like universal basic income or something like that, and that's the post-work future promise, right? We still do activities. We still build things. We still clean up environments, but we're not doing it in order to survive. And right now we're doing it to survive. We have to do it, or else. Okay. So that's kind of the essence of the non-workers paradise, right? And one of the things you see down the bottom, and I don't know if you're seeing it, but one of the biggest mega trends that I've seen in the last 10 years is this kind of, in all the different domains or topics we're studying, is this shift to sort of local, decentralized means of access, like networked, local, decentralized, right? Away from centralized hierarchies, if you will, right? Major shift. You see it all over the place. And almost all the images I found around this kind of non-workers paradise idea was all, local direct organize, right? Local direct democracy, participant groups, like, how do we, and the big problem, the big challenge is, how do you, if you will, how do you scale that up and make it work on a, kind of a regional, national, global scale? But almost all of them talk about the local model. And there's some really good ideas brewing there. Right? There's some really good ideas. Now, again, it's going to take a while to figure it out. So there's obviously artificial general intelligence and, augmented, so there's a lot that says this could really be a different world. But there's a couple of key ideas. So number one, scarcity to abundance. We already have abundance if we distribute it fairly. But imagine if we, if you will, multiply that abundance over the next 10 or 20 years. And what's the problem here, right? It's just a giant distribution problem, a tricky political problem, but there'll be enough. If we use the technology bounty wisely, this is great. And you might, I don't know if anyone was tracking Sam Altman and OpenAI when they started. His original idea was we're going to scrape all the stuff off the web, put it into our AI engines, and then give it back to everybody for free. Knowledge will be free for everybody. Yahoo, right? That's a great concept. But in the capitalist world, he couldn't make it fly, so they had to start charging, and here we are. It's just another capitalist tool, right? But that idea that what if we use that bounty to give it away? And the other part of tech-led abundance that I think is, again, one of the one of the scarce ones is you can see this idea that, like, in terms of some of the environmental challenges that we're running into, could be use these massive macro engineering projects. Are we going to use space-based resources to solve our problems? And I think, again, could be done with the right mindset. But right now, most of the futures work that I've seen in that sort of space, not everybody, of course, but in terms of like national priorities, it's all about basically taking capitalism on Earth and sticking it up into space. It's the same mindset. So again, that's why I think this one has great promise, but it also kind of scares me. And Donella Meadows came up with this in terms of how to, she was asked the question, well, if you were going to intervene in the system to make it work better, what would you do? And so she came up with this kind of taxonomy that, we tweaked it a little bit. And I think if you can think of these three buckets, well, what can we do to fix the system or intervene, right? One thing we can do is the metrics, the goals, the numbers, the rates. It's pretty easy to do, right? Okay. But does it really move the needle? No. It makes it a little bit better, a little bit worse, but it doesn't really change, right? But okay, still, it's something, right? Rules of the system. Aha. When you start changing the structure, remember we said a system's behavior is a function of its structure. You start messing with the structure. Ooh, now things are starting to happen a little bit. But of course, it's much harder to do that. Changing the rules of the system is tough. Get down to the bottom. So to Adele Meadows, what's the most effective way to change the system? You change the minds of the people running the system, or the people in the system. You change the paradigm. Same thing. That is the most powerful lever we have. But what do we know? And I would say proof, but I mean, one of my books was on the future of values, where I really studied what that World Values Survey and others had said about values change, and it's just slow. It just takes a long time. People don't change their mind easily. So again, but that ultimately is the most powerful lever we have. So I think as we sit here as futurists, knowing that if we want to change the world in this kind of a direction, I say we do all three things. Right? Yes, we do some work on mindset, but we don't rely on that because we know it's going to take 10 or 20 years. We do some of it. We do some steady work there. If we work on those rules of the system. Again, we know that's going to be harder. We got to be a little more patient, but some percent of our activity is on the rules. And of course, we do some things at the top on metrics because it shows actual progress. And I think, for me at least, one of the things that I've learned is I feel like, in helping so many different clients, deal with changes, it's so powerful to do something, even if it's little. So we're doing something, we're getting some motion, we're starting to learn as we get into motion, but we're also working on the larger problems of the rules of the system. We're also working on the larger problems of the mindset. Now, as an individual, maybe you find a comfort in one of those three. Maybe you're a big mindset person and you just want to work on that. That's okay. But if you know that these are our three levers, it's kind of strategically thinking, how do we want to, balance our activity, and do a little bit of all three of these things, or know where our tendencies, where our preferences are. Some people like to get out and just make stuff happen. Well, then you get up there in that metric space. So I think, in terms of what's the long-term plan look like, I think it's going to be some combination of these three things, right? How do we kind of get into motion now, and towards those futures? So that, I think, is the kind of the setup that I wanted to bring to y'all tonight. And then, again, I think we could have conversations about the how, the methods, as well as the what. What does it look like?